I'm Alex Marlow, editor-in-chief of Breitbart News and host of Breitbart News Daily on SiriusXM Patriot number 125. I'm very pleased today to have a very special interview with my friend Mark Levin, whose new book, American Marxism, is out now and has already sold an unfathomable amount of copies, which is terrific because it's only been out for 3 days. Mark, it is great to be on with you, and I want to start with this concept. When you're writing a book, your dream as an author, and I'm now a new author, as you know, and you've been very kind about my latest book, is to come up with an idea that will hit just the right time, that will come out at just the perfect moment for it. The idea of a book on American Marxism, even 6 months ago or a year ago, might have seemed far-fetched. But today, it seems so unbelievably timely. And if you read the book, it's almost like you wrote it last night and somehow it just came out.
First of all, Alex, thank you for having me and everything you guys at Breitbart do. Absolutely fantastic, and we conservatives rely on you folks. You know, I don't start out trying to sync up my books with events because it's impossible, as you know. But I started this book 16 months ago, and then I stopped, and then I picked it up again, and then I stopped. I picked it up again, and then I turned it in about 3 months ago and tried to keep it as contemporary as I could. But when you're talking about founding principles, both theirs and ours, things seem to come together. I wish this book had come out a month ago, but it was impossible to get it out that fast. And so I'm observing the scene. I've been around a little while now. I'm getting old, or older anyway. And I've been an activist really since I was 13 years old, and I'm trying to see what is going on and where they're taking us. And so the critical race theory, for example, which I spent time on, again, I turned this book in 3 months ago. I wrote about that 6 months ago because people were calling my show and talking to me about what they were seeing in the monitor going on with their kids and so forth as a result of the pandemic. The vast majority of people in this country would never have heard of critical race theory but for the pandemic and but for at-home teaching, where the parents are looking in the monitor and going, what the hell did that teacher just say to my kid? Which is why I now support cameras in the classroom and have been pushing for that for 2 months. I figure if courtrooms and cops can have them, union members with the NEA and the AFT should have them in the classroom. But you always hope your book is going to be meaningful and substantive and have something rational to say. All my books, none of them have been written about me, except one, Rescuing Sprite, about my dogs. But all the rest
Which I read.
of them, thank you. And that was the toughest book I ever wrote. I mean,
Wow.
I was crying over that board. I tell you, it was just terrible. But anyway, all the books I write, if you go one after the other, they're about philosophy, politics, history, some current events. I try to write them so they're lasting. And what happened with this book is I was watching and writing and thinking and researching. I didn't come up with the title until about 3 months before I turned it in, because I'm writing about Marxism. I'm writing about, where does critical race theory come from? Where does this degrowth, phony climate change movement come from? Why is the border open? What is this weird transgender movement in our classrooms? Where is that coming from? What's that all about? And so I figured out what it's all about, where it all comes from. I provide the scholars and the writings, and I comment on who's doing it and so forth, because I don't think we can beat it and claw our way back unless we know exactly who the enemy is. And these are not adversaries. They're not opponents. They're the enemy.
Let's define American Marxism. What is it, and how does it differ from sort of traditional Marxism that you might find in Capital or something that Marx wrote himself?
That is a great question. I call it American Marxism because it's the Americanization of Marxism. Now, you don't see Joe Biden nationalizing buildings, walking around like Hugo Chavez did and say, see that building? That's now ours, that sort of thing. This is the Americanization of Marxism and the fundamentals. And I explain this in the first chapter. The oppressed and the oppressor, class warfare, you hear it come from Biden and the Democrats all the time. The rich and the poor, like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. They go on about class warfare, caste systems they talk about. So they borrow heavily from Marx. They borrow heavily specifically from the Communist Manifesto. And you know Marx wrote, and Engels, a lot more than that. And the way that they talk and they think, they didn't just make this up. The war on American history. Joe Biden's war on American history to abolish the 1776 Commission, to trash the report they put out, to attack American history, to attack the founders, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, federalism, separation of powers. These are all the things that were set up to create a constitutional republic. Well, what does Marx say? Destroy history. The world begins today. We're the ones in charge of what history is to say. History begins today. There is no good society unless it's a communist society. He even rejected socialists. He hated socialists because he felt they were halfway communists and they were interfering with the Grand Revolution. When Lenin finally took over, he said, now what do we do? Because Marx doesn't tell them what to do once they win the revolution. So the revolution never ends, whether it's China and so forth and so on. So what is American Marxism? Critical theory, critical race theory, that's American Marxism. Imported into the United States by an individual by the name of Marcuse from the Franklin School in Berlin. He couldn't understand how the Nazis took over and the proletariat didn't rise up and impose communism. At the time, he escapes by the skin of his teeth. He comes to the United States of America. He works in seriatim for 3 different Ivy League schools who all give him tenure. And he hatches this critical theory, which is, simply put, in law schools and in law, it is the theory that law is corrupt because it's written by the people who are in control. So the victims, the minorities and so forth, they have to live in this suppressed society because the laws are written by the powerful. The laws are written by the dominant people. So a guy by the name of Derek Bell at Stanford Law and then Harvard Law, he takes that and he says, I'll take it one step further. Race. It should be not critical theory, critical race theory. Everything needs to be seen through the lenses of race. And when you look at the lenses of race, what do you see? A white dominant culture. And so all of our history is white. All of our laws are white. All of our policies are white. They're all intended to help the white man. And even when you have a civil rights movement and Supreme Court decisions, when you have a 1964-65 Civil Rights Act and EEOC and on and on and on, truly efforts to create a more perfect society, he argues that's a sham. That's all a sham. All that is intended to do is to enshrine the white dominant society. We have to destroy and overthrow that society. It's really critical Marxist theory that uses race as an excuse. Or the way I put it lately is, it's Louis Farrakhan dressed up as scholarship, but even worse, it's promoting Marxism. Real quickly, look at climate change. There's a reason they went from the ice age to the heat age to climate change. They were trying to come up with some kind of nomenclature to disguise what they're really about. What are they about? A war on capitalism. It is the degrowth movement that was exported to the United States by communists in Europe. It is a degrowth movement. Look, attacked energy. The Green New Deal is about attacking material advancement and so forth in our country. So what I explain in the book, just briefly, is how each one of these efforts are intersectional, as they call it. And that is, each one of these efforts, they work together, they aggregate to build this movement, and they Americanize the Marxism to try and appeal to the popular culture and through the media.
So many of these topics are so familiar and important to Breitbart. In our audience, Andrew Breitbart wrote about Marcuse 10 years ago, and we were the first to cover Derek Bell, and we were mocked by the media. The media mocked us because we were covering Derek Bell and his relationship with Obama. Well, I guess we might have called that one right. I'm guessing the establishment media is not going to give us credit for that, Mark. But let's speak about this. Who are the American Marxists? Is it the media? We know it's so many people in academics. Who are these people?
Well, it's people who espouse these things. You know, it's interesting. There are the leaders of the movements and the activists of the movements, and then the useful idiots, the fanatics who follow the movements. I have a chapter in this book, chapter 6, in which I explain what public journalism is. Public journalism is influenced by a man by the name of John Dewey a century ago, who destroyed public education. And basically, he goes to the Soviet Union in 1928, when Stalin's in control. We know what he was even back in 1920. He observes their schools and he thinks it's swell. He thinks it's terrific. And what are they doing? Indoctrination. They talk about the communal. They talk about sharing beliefs, sharing consciousness, and so forth. And he's the one who destroyed 100 years ago, our public education system, and it works its way today. Well, it's been embraced by journalism schools too. It's called public journalism, and what they mean by that is, and they always lie about who they are, by the way, what it really means is we're not going to just report on a story. We can't just report the news as objectively as we can. We're citizens too. We need to advance the ball. We need to push the narrative. This is so-called public journalism being taught in our journalism schools today. And there's book after book after book on this, professor after professor. And what is the narrative? The narrative is the so-called, I don't like this word progressive, I think it's a phony word.
Me
but
too.
It is this Marxist, neo-Marxist agenda. You can't find a penny's worth of difference between Black Lives Matter and the American media. Not a penny's worth. You can't find a penny's worth of difference between the degrowth so-called climate change movement and the American media. And I could go on. The American media are the mouthpiece for these movements. So they may not like being called American Marxists, but they are.
You know, one thing in the Dewey section that was really striking to me is how he wrote about how the peasant farmers in the Soviet Union were seen as the biggest obstruction to collectivism. This really feels like this is playing out here, where it seems like the people, the populace, the populists are really the obstruction to American Marxism.
That's exactly right. And in fact, in Ukraine, the peasant populations there resisted communism altogether. And Stalin got sick of shooting them one at a time, so he encircled Ukraine. He starved them. Millions and millions of Ukrainians died between 1932 and 1933, millions. Solzhenitsyn writes about how they would hear at night Ukrainians trying to break into the gulag. That's how desperate they were, and they couldn't. So they're starving to death in the streets. There was cannibalism. They were eating whatever animals they could eat. And Stalin did that to wipe out any resistance. And the New York Times played a significant role in this too. I wrote about it in my prior book, but also in here. They had a man by Walter Duranty, who was their Moscow bureau chief. He was on the payroll of Stalin. Stalin got him a girlfriend, got him a car, gave him the best foods. And so the New York Times knew that Duranty was a liar because the British reporters said he was a liar. And he would say that there wasn't any real nefarious going on. It was a bad harvest and on and on and on. And the people who read the New York Times were reading this stuff. And the management didn't do anything about it. And he got a Pulitzer Prize for it. And by the way, that's the same New York Times, as I've said many times, that covered up for most of the Holocaust. And it's the same New York Times that helped celebrate and help advance the guerrilla warfare that would become the Castro regime in Cuba. So when people say, have the New York Times interviewed you about your book, or what's the New York Times going to say about? I said, that corporation is a heinous, poisonous corporation. And the idea that it is the gold standard for the American media says a hell of a lot, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I had a whole chapter on them in my book, Breaking the News, and I was shocked at what I learned. And it was my favorite chapter in your book on freedom of the press. So, and at Breitbart, we blamed them flat out for the Castro regime directly. So,
and you're right.
I'm guessing they're not going to be thrilled about this book. The book again is American Marxism, out now. The author Mark Levin also has a terrific talk show, Mark Levin Show, Life, Liberty, and Levin on Fox, and always been a great friend of Breitbart. Mark, why are they doing this? Why are the American Marxists doing this? What is their problem with this country?
You know, this is the great question, because what we've never been able to figure out is this. Liberty gives tyrants the liberty to destroy liberty. It's a strange thing, but it's true. You will see people who hate the Constitution, like Black Lives Matter, and insist it was written by white slave owners, who wave it around to defend their right to protest. You will see a man like Joe Biden appear at the Constitution Center the other day, who is trashing the Constitution and tries to eviscerate the authority of the states under federalism and under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. Why are they doing this? Because they're evil. And my attitude is this, and I say it in the first chapter. We need to wake up to this. We need to see it for what it is. We need to call it what it is. And the question why, to a point, is almost beside the point, because it's here, it's now, and if we don't claw our way out of the abyss, we're going to stay in the abyss. And so this, you know, it's an interesting point. If you look around the world and you look at American history, most societies aren't free. Most societies don't have free economies. Most societies have some form of totalitarianism or autocracy or what have you. We and a few other countries are the exception. We're the exception throughout world history, throughout mankind's history. And so the fact that we are trying to defend ourselves, this little safe haven, from all that swirls around us, is very, very important, because it would appear to me that, and some people think this is controversial, I just say it's factual, it would appear to me that throughout most of the history of mankind, it has been a push for or an institution of tyranny, not liberty. Even though individuals want liberty, tyrants who try to take control do not. You know, you and I and our audiences, we wake up every day and say, how can we make the country better? I got to do my job. How can I do my job better? I want to take care of my family. Maybe I'll have a pension, maybe that, so forth. Our enemies in this country wake up every day and say, how do I destroy this country? How do I destroy an institution, Breitbart? How do I destroy an individual, maybe me? And they work at it 24/7. This is what drives them. This is the obsession. Eric Hoffer wrote a tremendous book, The True Believer, which I've cited in almost every one of my books, and he explains the fanatic, how it is a religious ferocity, the mass movements that they create. In the book, I talk about how our universities are creating mass movements, Hate America, Inc., people to hate their own country and their own family and their own faith, because that's the nature of evil.
Let me ask you about one of the scariest concepts that you address in the book. And we talked briefly about how neither of us like the word progressive. Well, you read about the degrowth movement. This is a really, really, really frightening thing, and it's happening here. It's part of this American Marxist culture. What is it, and who's pushing it?
The degrowth movement is really a throwback movement. They like to talk about Mother Nature and back to nature. Well, first of all, there's no Mother Nature. And secondly, there is no back to nature. Nature can be a very, very dangerous thing. Earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, heat waves, and all the rest. So what they try to do is they try and use natural occurrences in order to push their ideological position. Their ideological position isn't to save the polar bear. Their ideological position isn't for clean air or clean water. We have mostly clean air and clean water in this country. Their ideological position isn't that we will use up the world's resources. We couldn't use up the planet's resources if we spent every second of every day trying to do that. We've barely touched the surface of what's on this planet. It is a massive place, and it is made up of elements that we're not even familiar with. So there's an arrogance to this. But what it is it is a Marxist movement dressed up as an environmental movement. It comes out of Europe, as I explained. It is a degrowth movement. There are professors that are pushing it in this country and all around the world. And the degrowth movement is an attack on capitalism, materialism, wealth creation, opportunity. This is why you used to hear Obama and others say we're 3% of the world's population and we use 25% of the world's resources. Well, nobody's stopping the rest of the world from using all the resources they want to. It's just that the capitalist system uses them more efficiently. And by the way, we don't keep them for ourselves. If somebody wants to buy our products and services, we'll sell them overseas too. So we improve the fate of man. They oppose technological advances, but the real anger is with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution demonstrated that Marx was wrong, and wrong in every respect. The Industrial Revolution wasn't the great proletariat masses rising up and overthrowing the society. It created the great mass of people in this country. It taught us how to feed each other. It taught us how to clothe each other. It taught us how to house each other. It was the greatest economic burst of opportunity and growth and wealth creation in human history. Now, they try to turn to robber barons and trash some of these guys. Some of them were very, very tough. But you can thank them for lights and electricity and automobiles and steel and so much more. The Industrial Revolution was not just a few guys who got ultra rich. It created the society that exists today. So they hate it. Marx hated it. Marx attacked it. The Marxists today attack it. They attack smokestack industries. They attack manufacturing industries because they do not want us to produce. They do not want us to grow. So it is a degrowth movement, as I explained in the book, that was imported into the United States. All of these ideologies have been imported into the United States because, as you know, Alex, when John Locke wrote his second treatise, people would say to him, well, where does this society that you write about so beautifully, and so where does it exist? He says America, because America doesn't have all the baggage of feudalism and monarchy and all these other things that took place in Europe and other parts of the world. America. And so when the left says, you know, in Europe they do this, we ought to do it. We're not Europe. We're America. But they're trying to make us Europe, and they're actually trying to make us worse.
Yeah, it's not a progressive movement at all. It's a regressive movement. I want to ask you about how immigration fits in all this, because the Marxists, the American Marxists, want an open border. People still want to come here, even though we're told constantly it's a horrible country. And then when they get here, they're now encouraged not to assimilate. It's all very confusing.
Well, it's all very tactical. You have people who are escaping cultures and societies because even the Democrats and the media say they're horrific situations, they can't eat, they're crime, people are threatened, they don't have proper judicial systems, and then they come to the United States and they're told not to assimilate. You know, President Trump called these places from which these people are trying to escape S-hole places,
right,
and he was
right.
attacked. And yet when you hear
Yes.
people like Durbin, they put down these countries and these societies. They say they're terrible, these people need somewhere to go. So they're schizophrenic, they're hypocrites, but that's the nature of the left. And so this lat-crit movement, I think is what you're talking about, is part
Right.
of this critical race movement. And the theory there, and it's being pushed in our universities heavy duty, it's called Chicano studies, particularly for Mexicans, but not just the Mexicans. It is this, in a thumbnail sketch. The United States of America is an illegitimate country. It was founded by white Protestants from Europe who came into this America, the Americas, conquered the land, created colonies, then created a country. And it is they who are the illegal aliens. And people, indigenous peoples throughout America who wish to come to the United States are returning to their homeland. And so there's no such thing as an illegal alien unless you're talking about what they called United Statists. That would be
Right.
any of us. And so open borders, what's wrong with open borders?
Right.
We're just letting the indigenous peoples back into the country. This is obviously what Joe Biden has bought off on. He doesn't say it, but there can be no other explanation for open borders than this. And of course, the demand by the Democrat Party, which is more and more like an autocratic Marxist party throughout the world, that people come into this country because they think they're going to vote one day 2/3 Democrat, which is another reason they don't want the Cubans in here, who
Right.
vote basically 2/3 Republican.
Let's speak briefly about CRT. You write a little bit about white fragility, which is a concept that essentially if you don't accept critical race theory, then it's because you're a fragile white. So this is where they try to checkmate us, Mark. So if we dismiss it on rational grounds, then we're actually just fragile white people, and we need to understand our white rage, and thus we should be discounted.
And you know, Derek Bell kind of set this argument in place. Because if you read him, and when you read him, it's very depressing. He's very, he's a very diabolical guy. But anyway, their argument is, and it's circular.
And by the way,
really
not
is,
too bright
yeah,
if you listen to Thomas Sowell.
not too bright. And I agree with Thomas Sowell when you read his stuff. And he's not the only one. Same with Marcuse. But their argument is this, that if you're white, you have no say in this. You're the problem. So you're cut off. Well, but I'm an individual white guy. I'm not racist. It doesn't matter. You come out of that white culture, you're the subject of our dispute. You're the subject of our criticism. So you don't have the experience that I do, so I'm not going to even engage you in discussion. That's why they do not believe in free speech. That's why they do not believe in freedom and competition of ideas and so forth. So they close the door. They have that figured out. And what is that? That's Marx. Marx said, I don't need to debate with you. There's nothing to debate. I'm right, you're wrong, I'm righteous, and you're not. You're the oppressor, I'm the oppressed. I'm the victim, you're the perpetrator. And so I don't want to hear from you. And so this is truly outrageous in a society like this. Completely turns the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and all the rest of it on its head. It is a radical, Marxist, racist, Farrakhan-like ideology dressed up, as I said, as scholarship. So that is the nature of critical race theory. Now, they're trying to dress it up differently on MSNBC and other places. Oh, it has nothing to do with Marx. And they bring this guy Kendi in and so forth. First of all, this guy, for all his yammering, has made millions off this ideology. So much for his Marxism. But he didn't invent it. I don't give a damn what he has to say. As for white fragility, isn't it amazing of a white woman writing about white fragility? I mean, these self-hating individuals who are truly, when you get to the bottom of it, absolutely nuts. And they're given these platforms and people buy their books and so forth. The fact is that it's not about white fragility. I don't know. Do you walk around and saying, I'm white, I'm white, I'm white? It doesn't even enter your head, does it?
No, that's the whole point is I don't think about it at all.
Yeah. No, nobody does. And so what they're learning is there is no white fragility. People are standing up, all races, all backgrounds, all colors, and they're saying, you know what? You people are full of S, and we're going to push back. And I think now that they've crossed the red line into our elementary schools and that they're affecting people's lives personally, whether it's at the workplace, whether it's their kids, whether it's their economic ability, that is to survive, I think they've made a huge mistake, and it's up to us to take advantage of it.
The book is American Marxism. Mark Levin has defined the threat, and it's here, and it's a big one. That's why he's kind enough to give us all this time. It's from Threshold Editions, my publisher, and it's a terrific book. I recommend it to everyone. Mark, the last question for today, and it's sort of a two-parter. The one thing that spoke to me throughout the book, you address it directly at the beginning, but also kind of throughout the book. I think the alternative to American Marxism is rugged individualism. That's what they're trying to stop, and that's what makes me proud to be an American, is that we've had so many great rugged individualists like yourself and like Andrew Breitbart and so many others, Donald Trump, who have led the way. But are we going to become an endangered species, the rugged individualists? So how do you push back?
Well, we're not going to have time here. My last chapter is the pushback chapter, which is We Choose Liberty. And I provide scores of individual things that we can do, specific things with links and organizations that we can talk to. It depends on how active an individual wants to be. I mean, you can file complaints with the IRS against the teachers union because they have certain nonpartisan elements that they've filed under. You can file FOIA complaints from your desk, or you can do more. And I've argued fundamentally that we need to use the left's tactics against the left, as well as additional tactics. For instance, corporations, shareholder meetings, why did the left only show up? Hundreds of us should show up at these shareholder meetings and make our voices heard, and loudly, and in a polite protest. We can do this too, you know. Teachers unions are our enemy. They are Marxist, there's no question. They are an appendage of the Democrat Party. They are in business to make as much money and have as much power as they can. They don't give a damn about our kids. If you haven't learned anything in the last 18 months, you've learned that. And they've announced that regardless of what parents think or taxpayers think, they're going to push this ideology. Well, it's time to push back. We have FOIA laws. We have organizations that can bring lawsuits. You have lawyers in your communities that can bring lawsuits. These are civil rights violations. They are not free to teach your children racism. They're not free to do that. And we should use the civil rights laws against them. And I go through the book in great detail in Chapter 7. So I've tried to, this book is sort of a fusion of scholarship. There's over 400 endnotes if people want to track things down. My explanation of what these people are saying. And then, now what do we do about it? Well, here's Mark's ideas, and there's a lot of them. And you can add your ideas to them. One of the key things I do mention, Alex, is we ought to create what I call community committees. Now, community committees, there are some in communities, and what are these community committees? Well, you know, even during the Revolutionary War, there were various committees set up or loose-knit organizations in different towns and so forth, and they had a manner in which they could communicate with each other. And oddly enough, on the left, they do exactly the same thing. We don't. We'll point out, look at these parents in Loudoun County. They're great. Look at these parents in this school system in Illinois. They're great. In California, that's not good enough. We're facing an enemy that's organized and fights us every day. So I'm thinking these community committees can share strategies and tactics. They can go to school board meetings. They can go to town meetings. They can put pressure on congressmen and state legislatures. We have numbers, and there's power in numbers. We have resources. We own all these damn institutions. We pay for them. These teacher union members, they're our employees. These superintendents that thumb their noses at us, they're our employees. Let's go on offense. Let's go on offense. These universities and colleges, they take in hundreds of billions of dollars every year. I'm putting tuition aside. Well, where do they get that money? Mostly from the states. Okay, if we're in Republican states with Republican state legislatures, start cutting their budgets. Find out how they hire faculty. Fight tenure. Get copies of their contracts through FOIA. There are things we can do to get information, to harass them, to push them on their heels, and let them know we're not taking this crap anymore.
We'll leave it there. Mark Levin, the book is American Marxism. Get it now.